What if the real creative ops superpower isn't process or tooling or scale? What if it's something messier, something more human? Today's guest is Matt Ionta, a former agency producer and creative ops leader at HubSpot, now turned go to market leader. My conversation with Matt surfaced a lot, from a shared love of classic movies to the story of his career journey. Like, what happens when someone raised on copywriting dreams ends up building systems that help teams scale, prioritize, and actually do their best work? What do you do when you're drowning in 400 creative requests, from sticker designs to full website rebuilds? And what makes confusion and surprise the two most dangerous and contagious forces inside any organization? Matt's core belief is simple. His real job, then and now, has always been creating the conditions for others to succeed. That mindset powered his work in creative operations, and he's transferred it in fueling his success as a go to market leader. So, if you've ever wondered whether your creative ops skills can open new doors beyond just creative, this episode is your permission slip and your roadmap. Let's get into it. Matt Ionta, welcome to the Creative Ops Podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a real full circle moment because I remember it was like probably about 2018, 2017 maybe, and I was facing some hairy problems within our org structure at my previous role, and Googling anything and anywhere to find some insight on creative operations. And I found your initial podcast, and at the end of one of the episodes, you were like, "Any thoughts, any questions? Email me." I emailed you, and you responded, and we talked, met in person even a number of times, and I consider you the godfather of creative ops, and I mean that in the most endearing way possible. And I'm happy to be here. So,
Well, a couple of things. One is you said facing a hairy situation, which, if we now have a YouTube channel, so anyone watching this on YouTube is
yeah,
going to go, well, there is no hair on the screen
yeah.
except on faces. We both have beards, but nothing up top.
I should have worn my
Two,
glasses. We could have really mapped today.
we could have been twins, except for
Yeah.
my few tanning bed sessions. And I appreciate the Godfather reference. A few others have used that as well. I'm Canadian, so I get very uncomfortable when people, well, I guess when people compliment me. It's a Canadian thing to do, I guess. And yeah, we've known each other for a while. I still remember that first conversation we had back in, as you said, 2017, 2018, and um, I was tickled when you reached out, because I couldn't believe people were still finding those original 10 episodes from like 2015, and they still found
yeah.
value in it. And even now, like, we're at 40 plus episodes with this incarnation of the Creative Ops podcast. And
Wow. Already. That's awesome.
yeah, and I'm always saying, like, reach out, because and honestly, it's like selfish of me, because you and I know each other. I'm like just insatiably curious. So I will just my calendar is open. So if somebody reaches out and says, hey, I want to chat and just bounce some things around. Yeah, cool. I'm down with it. So if anyone's listening, Matt was the first one to do it. Others have done it, but please, if you've ever thought about it, just go ahead and do it, and just reach out to me. LinkedIn
and
is always the best way.
Nish will hit you back, and he will help you out. And I think like in this space of creative ops, it's kind of this like exclusive club of people who have really lived a lot of these problems. And honestly, when we first made contact and I talked through the issues that I was facing and my job with you, like I was sort of taken by my first like thought just being, wow, I'm not crazy. Like this is something that other people have gone through. This is a valid challenge to face. And my ideas of how to solve it are valid. And it's just really good to have someone to bounce that off of because Nish, even before this, I mean, we talked about how a lot of the skills within creative operations are transferable to operations of any kind, which is kind of a preview to the episode in a way here, I guess. But that transferability, it's still like it's just really helpful to have just another set of eyes and ears who knows those exact challenges and can say like, yeah, I think your instincts are right, or maybe have you thought about this because this I've seen this work in other capacities, whether creative wise or not. So definitely really appreciate everything you've done, man, and everything you're doing for the industry as a whole.
Well, thanks. And, before we dive into the episode, just one more comment on, being able to reach out to others, just not myself, but it's been amazing to see over the last couple of years, like much more vibrancy in the community of creative operations, right? And I'm not talking about like the events and conferences and things like that, but the peer-to-peer community, like what Susie Hall is doing with her Inside Out community through Aquint, what Emma Sexton is doing in the UK, the in-house agency Leaders Club. I have, and I was just speaking to
Yeah.
somebody earlier today, and she was saying through Susie's Inside Out community, they help set up like coffee dates amongst creative ops people, and it's like that peer-to-peer connection and sharing of like, here are my challenges or here's something I'm working on. And like you were saying, it's the ability to go, I might feel like an island within my organization, but there's others
Commonly, yeah.
who are also islands unto themselves. So if we can sort of like more proactively connect with each other, you start to create this archipelago, right? Like where there is that sort of connection and you could get to each other, reach out to each other and be there for each other. So it's been amazing to see that over the last couple of years. And I'm glad that this podcast is a small part of that. And I think the role of this podcast is really to have conversations with individuals such as yourself to just share backgrounds, experiences, expertise, ideas, because I really think the conversation for me is the chisel for how we figure out where we go next, individually, collectively, as a profession. And I think that's a good segue into the conversation chisel we're going to be holding onto today and sculpting away with through this episode is you've got a background in creative operations, but you took that skill set and now you're applying it in a very different way. Um, so you went from a fairly large company with a pretty big creative ops team to more of a not a startup, but like a scale up company, smaller in size, dramatically much smaller than when you were coming from, and you're much more on the go to market side of things. So let's start with like, tell us a bit about your creative ops background. Like, how did you get into that role, and what was your last creative ops stop? And then we'll sort of transition into what you're doing today. And I think there's a lot to explore in terms of like, as you're saying, taking your creative ops skill set, applying it in different ways, and based on what you're doing today, how has that sort of made you think differently or cast a new light on your creative ops experience?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, one of the things you said before I even, this will be kind of a roundabout way to get to that answer, but one thing you said in terms of like, where do we go next as a discipline, I think that aligns with my story, but it also lends to like, how did we get here in the first place? Because I've heard you say on previous episodes, like creative operations was sort of born out of the role of a project manager, you know, or a digital producer in some cases, especially as creative and technology have merged pretty much like inextricably now. You can't really have one without the other in most cases, and so I think I'm very interested to see, and I have to give you a lot of credit for almost bringing definition to the role as creative operations because, however many years ago, 15 or so, when I started my career and, moved up to Boston to start doing some of this type of work, like I'd never heard that term before. It didn't mean anything to me. It was all project management, digital production, delivery managers, account management type of work, whatever might sort of have trace DNA in the realm of creative operations as a profession. But for me, that sort of, was my background in the creative space. Since I was probably 16, I knew I wanted to work in an ad agency. And my number one goal was to be a copywriter and write and create an ad that ran during the Super Bowl. So I never quite made it to that point. But I was working at ad agencies in Boston for a while, probably about to the tune of like 7 or 8 years, that were just, we had some massive clients, like $700-800 million worth of media spend throughout the course of the year. Our agency's churning out everything from banner ads to TV commercials to like full website experiences. And I was always in that sort of like, operational, organizational, structural, project management, production type of position. And I just really enjoyed it because it kept me in the creative space, kept me exposed to so many cool and evolutionary creative ideas, especially during that time period. We're talking about, like I said, I think I might have even just said it, flash banners back in 2010 when I started at Arnold Worldwide, to now some of the like AI driven stuff that we're talking about that tends to happen at a lot of the creative operation shops now. So it's been a wild ride through that period. But my previous role, like you said, before I made this sort of pivot in my career, was at HubSpot. And I know you've had a couple other HubSpotters on here on your show, many of whom I've worked with and love and have good connections with. But I came on there as the head of creative, or I guess it was the head of creative project management, and then the type of work we were doing sort of evolved beyond just project management. There was a lot of branding, brand infrastructure, creative solutioning, templatization, a lot of work that was beyond just schedules and resource plans, which is the base level of the project management definition. So once we started to notice that the field was changing a little bit and the description of the work was changing a little bit, that's when I A, reached out to you, and B, sort of more formally talked about things in a creative operations space. And that's where I was until my time at HubSpot came to an end. And since then, yeah, I'm actually working for a company called
Actually,
Squareworks. Oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, let's take a pause there before we get into what you're doing today, because you said a couple of things I want to dig into. One is, what year was it when you were 16? And I'll do the math afterwards to figure out
Yeah,
how old you are now,
yeah.
'cause I can't do it in my head. But how old were you when you were 16 and said, I have to work at an ad agency? Because most of us are like, if I could jump, I want to be Michael Jordan, or if I could throw a football properly, I want to be Troy Aikman. Like, how did you know at 16 you wanted to work in an agency? I've
that's
never heard
actually
that from anyone.
that's actually an interesting question. I just loved advertising. Like I remember there was a show on like around New Year's Eve every year, and it was like the best ads of the year. And they were so funny, so creative, so clever. And timing wise, I would have been 16 in about 2001. So I was
Okay.
born in 85, just turned 40, so crossed that threshold last month. But yeah, I actually got involved in an organization at my school. It was an interesting pivot. I went to public high school outside of Pittsburgh, and we had something called the Student Service Learning Center. And it was an amazing experience. Like we got to work with a lot of organizations throughout the community. And, we did all kinds of different things for them, whether it was grant writing, press releases for their events, or marketing and advertising for things that they might be doing. And we worked with some nonprofits, some, other schools, some churches, some things within our own school. And people just didn't have huge budgets to work with real agencies. It gave us experience as students to do a lot of this work. And I remember we worked with some church about like they're getting trying to increase like attendance at their Easter mass, and we just started to come up with a bunch of like crazy ad concepts, and it was just really fun. And the whole idea of just like exposing creative ideas, seeing people's reactions to them, tweaking them, delivering them, seeing them live and in action, it just kind of like built like a developed an itch for me that I really wanted to scratch. And so I did a lot of marketing work, and like mass media related studies in college, and got some weird like marketing peripheral jobs out of school, but things really started to latch on for me when I started at an ad agency up here in Boston in 2010. So
And did you initially, like, when you started at in the agency world, did you want to go in on the creative side and then you transition to more the operations side, or did you sort of like immediately know, I want to be close to creative, but ops is where I'm gonna make the biggest impact?
well, I think if you were to ask like, well, to answer that question first, yes, I wanted to be a copywriter.
Okay.
But when it came to getting a foot in the door and getting a job at an agency, I didn't have a portfolio. I didn't have a lot of background. I took a couple like smaller courses. I tried doing some like, pro bono type work, and it wasn't very well honed, if you will. So I was like, the best foot in the door is probably in account management. And then I have to give a shout to my old colleague and friend Ryan Harms, who actually you should probably have on the show. He works at Google in their creative lab. And he was like, hey, I think you might be, just based on your skills, how I've seen you present, I think you'd be good in the digital production space. And he sort of plucked me from account management, working on Progressive Insurance account, to digital production, working on a variety of accounts where we did a lot more just innovative. Maybe pulled me a little further from that more traditional work that I dreamt about when I was 16, like a big TV commercial that my parents and grandparents would see. But it was stuff that felt like it was a little more cutting edge, a little more impactful, a little more trackable. All of the stuff that I think has made digital advertising sort of the exploding asset that it has been over the last decade, with so many just changes and innovations along the way. So yeah, that was the trajectory.
Yeah, that's an interesting background because you clearly have a love for the creative work itself. You wanted to be a copywriter. I'm going to guess you probably binged Mad Men, and maybe you're up to your fifth viewing. No?
Oddly enough, I've never seen that show.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and I give my wife a hard time about that stuff because she is an Italian American girl from Philly, and she's never seen Rocky, and she's never seen the aforementioned Godfather. And
What?
yet, when I say yeah, and when I say I've never seen Mad Men, people are like, "What? You've never seen that show? You were an ad guy for so long." And speaking of my wife, that's what I was going to say earlier. Like, you were to ask her, the operations place is where I belonged from day one, just given my skill set, my proclivity, the way I am. My entire life is in Google Drive. It's in, just my level of like meticulous organization has always been present since well before I was even 16. So yeah, it was sort of a natural fit that I think, I was realistic enough with myself. It wasn't quite realizing that I would never play in the NHL, which, as a Canadian, that was for you in your case. I don't know. I grew up in Pittsburgh, so I was a big Mario Lemieux fan, and I was like, God, I want to be just like him. And it wasn't cut out for me. So, looking at my skills and my passions and trying to merge them together, the still nascent space of creative operations sort of emerged as where I started to kind of, get a foothold.
And that's amazing. And often I meet creative ops leaders like you that I didn't know had this sort of creative background where you had a love for it, you got exposed to it, you tried your hand at it. As you were saying, you did it while you were still in school a little bit. You did it early in your career, but then realized your zone of genius was on the production and ops side. And you clearly had some people throughout your career that helped guide you in the right direction so that you
Yeah.
could stand firmly in that zone of genius. And so before we get into what you're doing today, because I think your background is super interesting. You were at HubSpot when it went through like this massive scale up period. It was exploding as a company, revenue wise, like size wise in terms of employees, number of customers, and creative was along for the ride with that as well. How
Yeah.
did you sort of see the evolution of creative operations during that period of like, seismic and rapid growth?
Oh man, I can't even describe sort of the lack of creative operations that existed when I walked through the door in 2016. And I remember asking my manager at the time, Cindy Goodrich, I was like, "Hey, so what software do we use to track our work?" She's like, "Well, you tell me. Like, we brought you on to do the project management work." And so it was really unstructured, but still like surprisingly effective because we just had some really brilliant people. And you know, I think that's something else I've seen an evolution of when it comes to technologists, when it comes to developers, even when it comes to designers. There's a lot of stereotypes about them being like flighty and, obsessed with the fluff beyond what us mere mortals can understand. Or, there's the memes about, web developers being like hobbits in their basement just doing like development work. Virtually none of the folks I've worked with, whether it was at the agencies or at HubSpot, have been that way. And they were just really good partners. And I think that was one of the biggest advantages of kind of like working there in a space like HubSpot, was people not only knew that we needed to improve, but they were willing to try something new in terms of a new process, a new structure. But the biggest evolution for creative operations that I saw was really just setting up avenues for prioritization and intake and just overall evaluation of project success, and then what would be next on the horizon. Because when I started, I was basically just on the receiving end of upwards of like, 400 creative requests a year. And they could vary from like, hey, make a sticker that I can put on my water bottle, to let's re-architect, rebuild, and redesign HubSpot.com in 3 months. It was really, it was like comparing apples and I can't even think of something as far reaching as an Apple. It was like apples and Ford F-150s. I'm like, how are we supposed to build or handle these different things? So really what we had to do was set up parameters for people to understand how we operated and where they fit within that operating model. And I think when I first, reached out to you, we were sort of in the second stage of that because we just kept continuing to grow. And I would admit that at that time we weren't like making every step perfect, but we started to invest, or we saw leadership invest a lot in web developers and in designers and video producers, and not a lot of investment in project management. It was still like a 2 or 3 person team for a lot of that time, and so we were frankly struggling a little bit to stay on top of the work and had to you know teach a lot of our developers or our designers how to fish, so to speak, in terms of here's how you can run a stand-up meeting, here's how you can make your updates in Jira or in Asana or whatever we might have been using at the time. And it was really like a bootstrap type of solution until we got a little bit of advanced investment into scalable systems, freed up some of my time to develop the brand infrastructure system, which has now evolved into Creative Solutions, which I know Mark Brady talked to you about on here. But it was a journey that really required you know prioritization and sorting of requests, because without that you're just kind of scrambling and a little bit rudderless to make sense of what your team's supposed to be working on. And that, I've said this before, and I'll go to my grave saying it when it comes to creative operations. I think the most harmful things that can befall an organization are confusion and surprises, because they are just immensely contagious. If people are confused about where they go, who they're working with, what's on deck, what's the priority, then that just permeates every meeting, every working session, everything, and people lose confidence in the work. And with surprises, you want to stay in front of the work that you're doing and ensure that, you have at least a rough idea of what you can expect in terms of your workload, the volume of work, the type of work, the style of work that is expected of you over the next period of time. So those were sort of like in a rambling nutshell, I guess, sort of the structure that we pursued while we were there.
Yeah, I think that'll be a good segue as we get into like sort of what you're doing today. But a couple of things that maybe for us to drill down into. You're talking about how like project management in terms of investment and that was lagging as all these other resources were growing, really to feed the appetite of the growing marketing machine at HubSpot, right? To
Yeah.
meet market demand. And but sometimes those constraints are good because it sounds like it almost led to like what you and your colleagues were doing is you're almost like productizing here's what we do and what we don't do and helping like everybody else think about like how do we actually do the work, how do we prioritize the work, and part of prioritization is surfacing those constraints, like what matters and what doesn't matter and what is possible and what is not possible. And I think very often that's sort of like those constraints, we're always trying to eliminate them, but sometimes we should actually they're actually a feature and not a bug, because having those constraints forces us to make better optimized decisions. Instead of saying we want to do everything, no, we can only do so much, right?
Yeah.
It's just like our monthly budget or whatever it is. It's like or our annual travel budget. Sure, I'd like to take Singapore Airlines first class, but that's sort of insane, right? Because that's going to
Yeah.
be like 3 years travel budget or something.
Yeah. Look, I think we certainly had a lot of success stories in terms of like, forward thinking, evolutionary ideas. But a lot of what we, you know, built out there, we sort of had to react to, or we would observe that, hey, our last couple, monthly creative reviews or whatever we were running at the time, we have some pretty high octane developers or really senior designers working on some pretty rote stuff, very repeatable work that I don't think is really maximizing their capabilities. And we have a lot of, stakeholders saying, hey, I'll swap my budget for two or three marketers, and instead, can you give me, two or three developers that can work on this work for me, and I'll be that direct conduit to them as a marketing leader. And I think we saw, like, through that process, like, hey, this is something that needs to be fixed operationally. Like, we don't want to create an operating model that is so rigid that nobody can step outside of it, or whatever else. But we want to make sure that people understand, like, there is a method to the way we approach work, and there is a payoff to sticking to that method and playing within those parameters. And you will see that in the form of success in our most, like, highly invested in and most frequently prioritized arms of the business. And that is really where our success started to multiply, because we had a couple stakeholders on the marketing side who really understood the value of, like you've talked about this before, bringing creative in as true partners. Like, they were in every, specific, like, department or team meeting. They were not only in those meetings, but they were contributing to those meetings. And there was a time where we had one of the highest performing people I've ever worked with, met, hired. Her name's Teeny Rose. She's still at HubSpot. She's she's the goat. But we had to pull her off of one, working team, because there's a new opportunity for her elsewhere, and we needed some more senior, know-how and stuff on that work. And that day when she left that account, or that lane as we called it at the time, it was one of, like, the saddest days, because it was like we were breaking up a family, you know what I mean? And to create that, like, there's ups and downs to it, because people might not be fully challenged. That's why we moved Teeny on at that point. But um, it's really hard to replicate that level of, like, teamwork when you truly kind of hit your groove. It's sort of once you hit that, like, performing stage in the life cycle of a team, and they knew what each other were thinking. They knew which ideas to push on and which to pull back on. And that's sort of like the creative operations, like Valhalla, when you have a team that is working that efficiently, that effectively, and that much in sync. And so we really strove to achieve that. But, we had a success story when we had maybe four or five, like, prioritized lanes, or six or seven even. But then when people saw success in that, they were like, hey, let's get our 14th, 15th, 18th lane, and let's staff them all accordingly. And then the team bloats, and you need to find solutions for how you can sort of scale some of those, maybe lower hanging fruit deliverables.
I promised the listeners we're going to get to what Matt is doing today, but there's so much here, and when we get to what you're doing today, we're going to be referring back to this. But we'll see if I remember all four things I want to comment on. One is you're doing these review meetings, so you're getting together and going, like, what's working and not working in the process. And that wasn't you didn't wait for things to blow up. It sounds like that was almost like dev teams do retros after each
Yeah.
sprint.
Mhm. I mean,
And
things certainly blew up too from time to time. They always do,
yeah,
but yeah, that
well,
was our purpose, was to try to
yeah.
stay in front of it.
If they don't blow up, you're not pushing, right?
Yeah.
But I think the idea of doing retros is one I know some creative ops leaders implement, but it is such a low hanging piece of fruit to grab with massive returns in terms of, like, improving process and just, like, that relationship building, because then that leads to, it seems like, people will, like, talking about, I'll trade developers and I'll step into being the primary source of information and things like that. Like, those types of conversations tell me that, like, everyone was rooted in the outcomes versus the process for the sake of the process, right? And we're going to come back to that when we talk about what you're doing today for sure. Cause, like, I think, and I've been pleasantly surprised over the last couple of years, more and more creative teams and creative ops leaders are leading the charge on, we need to be more rooted in the outcomes of the marketing funnel or the revenue funnel and the business's goals, because
Yeah.
that's how creative, as you were saying, sort of becomes a fully integrated part of the team, and just not like, oh, those people over there with Photoshop and Final Cut Pro in the corner, right? It's like, no, it's more than just the mechanics of creative work. It's creative thinking, that mindset for, there's an outcome we want to achieve, and it shouldn't be just left to the marketers to go, "Oh, I know, I'll achieve the outcome through a webinar and a landing page and a 3-part email drip campaign." It's no, let the creative come into that and become part of the team. And the fourth point, you were mentioning that one individual who left that one team and went on to another project because it had high strategic value. And it's this idea, and Emma Sexton out of the UK talks about this quite a bit. It's this idea of almost decentralizing creative and having
Yeah.
it infused across the whole organization. And one of the things I've been thinking more about recently is the idea of like, do creative operations and demand gen and marketing, do these roles start to get organized into really go to market teams that are that are sort of like designed and oriented around specific like customer segments or geographic segments, however a company thinks about like organizing the market that they're going after, right? It could be a
Hmm.
vertical, it could be an industry, it could be a country, whatever it is. But it's like a go to market team that works together as a cohesive unit. Their own, it's their own like P&L, if you will. So like that really stood out for me in terms of what you're sharing.
I don't want to eat all our time, but I want to like volley
Yeah.
back on some of those because I think those points are really interesting. And I'll start with the last one because it's funny you say that because we kind of addressed ourselves as a centralized, decentralized team
Hmm.
because some of our creative leads, and particularly look, like I think this is a struggle that I think creative ops people may face. It may lead to maybe some of the lack of respect that the entity gets from time to time. Is it's rare you find someone who will be like, oh, I'm gonna be a designer here. If it's a marketer or someone else in the business, like, oh, I'll design this myself. I'll make this video myself. I'll write this code myself. You don't see that often because that is a highly, highly specialized skill. Project management, slightly less so. Let's not kid ourselves. Like a lot of it's like essentially it's more than just being organized, but it feels a little more like flexible in terms of someone's like, oh, well, I can run these meetings. I can touch base with the team. I can stay on top of some of this more visible stuff. And so I think we benefited from being rolled into the creative organization because, you wouldn't have designers, getting their work critiqued like technically by a marketer. You wanted a design manager to do that, a design leader. It was sort of an iron sharpens iron requirement that we needed in terms of someone who speaks my language, is in my centralized org, who knows the craft that I'm deploying here. That's who I want to be like reporting to, managing my work, overseeing, collaborating with, all the above. But that decentralization was where we would really shine because it was like, let's take on these problems that these teams have or these goals and objectives that they have. And if you'll allow me a quick aside, it's a two-part aside, but one of my favorite interview questions when I was hiring people at HubSpot was, what's the best project you've ever worked on? And for me, because as a project manager, like if it's the best project, you're going to light up. You're going to see a reaction from the person. Get a feel for what they're passionate about. But for me, I think the best project I ever worked on was when I was at Arnold Worldwide, the ad agency, and our client was Progressive Insurance. And the brief was really all it said was make Flo, like Flo from Progressive, the lady in the apron and the superstore, like make her the number one selling Halloween costume in whatever year it was, 2013. And that brief just sent our creatives in a million different directions. And they were all, each idea was more interesting than the next. And when you talk about focusing on outcomes, we came in second behind like the Green Man unitard from like Always Sunny, because I think it hit the same year. But it was an amazing project because you really got to see the value of creative, and the vagueness of that brief was where the power of the work was. But it was where some of the intensity came in from an operations standpoint. Like, I'm not trying to bridle these ideas, but let's make sure that we're like really fleshing them out and really laying them out in a way that they can be sold and be, resonate with the client when we present. And it reminded me of the second tangent, which people who've worked with me before have heard this a million times, but I went to an Atlassian conference many years ago, and the guy talked about the Russian space pen. If you've ever heard of this,
Yep.
and how the Americans made a space pen, and it was like however many millions of dollars to create it because he needed the ink to fall downward to the point of the pen in a zero gravity environment. And then the Russians got the same like idea or had the same task, but the brief was different, where they didn't need a pen that could write in space. They needed to write in space. And so the Russian space pen, some guy handed him out. It was just a pencil. And because he didn't face any of those constraints. And so I think those, like, what we call them, like green pasture, blue sky creative briefs, are what can really motivate and excite people and really get creative teams working in a way where that centralized capability can really help to, bring coordination to some of these decentralized teams problems, if that makes sense.
That makes a ton of sense. So before I volley back to you, I'll just say for the listeners who are, some of whom might be going, "Are you going to get to what Matt is doing now?" I'll say
I'm
this.
actually unemployed now. This is a big ruse. I have nothing to discuss beyond just my biography and
That's right.
fun work anecdotes. Yeah.
No, this is so I always gauge the value of each episode by is my curiosity peak, because ultimately that's the primary reason I do the podcast is I just wanted to follow my own curiosity. So big check on that. And two is I've actually heard from multiple listeners that they go, what they really enjoy about the podcast is it's not about like frameworks or black and white answers or go and do these five things and you'll have the silver bullet for problem X. They're like, it feels like I walked into the creative operations coffee shop. I sat down at the table and two nerds were at the table next to me just having a super interesting conversation and just going back and forth, and they ended up just eavesdropping and nursing their latte for the next hour. So in the spirit of that, I love the idea of centralized, decentralized, because yes, like those designers or developers or other experts are coming together. Even project managers or resource managers are coming together, but then to share what they're seeing and doing and what's working and what's not working. And then they could sort of take new perspectives, new learnings, new capabilities out across that decentralized organization, however decentralization shows up.
Yeah.
Again, it could be by industry, business unit, customer, a specific customer segment, or whatever that might be. And that story about the the green pastures brief, because everyone talks about creative briefs, and it's like the soul sucking part of the overall creative process, right? Because they didn't fill out the brief correctly, or it doesn't have the information we talked about, and blah, 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 right? Like tons of issues with it, and tons of complaints with it. But you just made me think about something because I've been talking to lots of agencies and in-house teams lately about reimagining the creative briefing process, especially in this age of AI. I think there's a huge opportunity. And one thing I've been talking to lots of teams about is the conversation is the brief. Because I would imagine if the brief is make Flo the Halloween costume the number one costume this year, the creatives, along with other stakeholders, marketers, business people, whoever it is, would have a series of conversations. And it's those conversations that are the brief, right? So, AI side note, record those meetings and then use AI to turn the conversations into the brief. And two is maybe we need to think more about like there's some briefs where you do need complete information, and I think that's more for transactional creative work, like,
Yeah. Agreed.
oh, we're doing a landing page, the webinars on this date, and some other like firm details, because again it's very transactional in nature. But maybe we should be more comfortable with like a one line brief, and then going, the real brief happens in the conversations where we talk about what do we want to do, why do we want to do that, what are we trying to achieve, what do we want like the intended audience to feel and do, and then use technology like AI to turn those conversations into the written brief, even like automatically generate some initial like concepts that people can react to.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you 100% because, like, in my current role, which I don't want to tease too much because I know there's a lot of build up here,
Yeah.
but I've actually had to play creative a number of times. Like, I wrote a lot of the copy with the help of like some AI tools for our website because we wanted to do a website revamp because we felt like our narrative wasn't really clear and it was not focused enough. Um, we have a couple smaller like advertising opportunities that are very specific where if I were a creative and I was also, this version of me was the client, I'm way too prescriptive than I ever would have encouraged some of my, marketing partners or clients to be. And so it is very eye opening in terms of, when you're on the creative team side, like this is what a good creative brief looks like. This is a good request looks like. It's not too prescriptive. It enables some creative leeway, but I agree. It depends on the type of work from time to time. And that's the delineation of like when should something be maybe a little more self-service, or when should something be a little more templatized versus when do we need a green pasture, 2 weeks of concepting, prototypes and proofs of concept type of work. I think there is a delta there. And that's why the operating model that is typically overseen and shepherded by the creative ops team is so important. But from what you said there, again, just two other quick volleys back, I think the most important thing that was said in that kind of first nugget from you in terms of reviewing my experiences at HubSpot, at Arnold, at Digitas, wherever, was you mentioned those review meetings were sort of like a big step in terms of relationship building, um, with the creatives, with your marketing partners, with your clients, with whoever. I think that relationship building, like another word for relationship building, is essentially like establishing trust. And I think that trust enabled us from a change management standpoint to really experiment and, try out new solutions and build new ideas without a lot of blowback or a lot of friction or static from the team. And that to me, there were a couple mornings or evenings when I was at HubSpot specifically where it's like, all right, tomorrow we're rolling out this new creative request form format, or we're rolling out this new operating model that everyone's gonna have to get in line with and people might not be thrilled with, because we had spent so much time evaluating the work of the creatives, working with and building relationships and establishing trust with our stakeholders and our clients, we got so much goodwill and like benefit of the doubt when it came to rolling out new solutions. And that is like immensely important. Beyond, maybe is the most important thing of all of this, or else, like you were alluding to, the robots should just do all of this shit for us. You know what I mean? Like, I think
Yeah.
that's a really valuable piece that I prided myself on personally within my career. And even in my new role, that's a little more sales oriented, realizing how important that is to build that trust and have those conversations. But the only other thing I would say, and it's a quick pivot away from that point, even, but that kind of centralized, decentralized, model, it felt like a little novel, or it felt like an inflection point where we had to make a decision one way or another at HubSpot. But in a way, that is the agency model. You talk to someone, hey, I work at the agency and I'm on the Coca-Cola team. I'm on the Progressive account. I'm doing this. Like you have designers, you have art directors, you have creative directors, you have videographers, you have all of them, and they are within their capabilities and their skill sets on that team, but they are essentially decentralized out to those accounts. And that was a model we essentially tried to adopt because agencies, they might cover this in Mad Men, but I missed it. Like they do this pretty well in terms of delivering to the needs of their specific clients and utilizing their resources to do that.
So, quick side note on movies and TV shows. My girlfriend Gloria has never watched The Godfather, and I don't think she's watched Rocky, and I idolized Rocky growing up. So,
Okay.
I think we're gonna send Gloria and your wife away to
Yeah,
watch
yeah.
those movies, and you and I are gonna do a Mad Men binge watch,
Yeah.
and just
Well,
go away and do
well, I
that.
think
Yeah,
I think if anyone who walks into the Creative Ops coffee shop, the Mad Men will just be on the TV, just so we can follow it there.
exactly.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
there's a big
and,
Rocky statue out front that they can get pictures with too.
so I'm gonna take us into what we actually got together to talk about, now that we're at the 42-minute mark, but I do wanna say something about what you're talking about. I think creative operations is as simple but as complex as, and I'm picking up on some of the things we've been talking about, because we in the creative ops world, a few years ago, it was like, yeah, it's about people, process, technology, and now it's people, process, technology, and data, and yes, all those things matter. I wonder if we need to reframe it and go, what we really need to be spending more time thinking about, like process and technology are tools, and we should think about them as like malleable, adaptable, like they are there to serve us. And by us, I mean they're there to serve our outcomes. So we need to be rooted much more in outcomes. And the human part of it is so critical, as you were saying. And because I think ultimately, work, great work, is a function of human beings working well together. Um, and that is simple to say. It is so hard to do. And the way you do it is thinking of like not just process. Process to me is about the tactical. How do we move the goalposts? Um, like not the goalposts. How do we move like the ball down the field, right? And get closer to the end zone. The process is the tactical. The technology is sort of like the enabling layer, the container. But it's that operating model. And you've heard me talk about it on the podcast. I think creative ops leaders need to think more about like their job is the system. It is the operating model for how we work together. And most importantly, as part of that operating model is how do the humans work together to produce the outcomes that matter? And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about that. Because on one hand, it almost seems like, yeah, people will figure out how to work together. But that's not life, right? Like
Yeah,
that's not even,
it's rare. Yeah.
it's rare. It's like even amongst 2 people, right? Like it's hard to make a relationship work, and now you make that exponentially more difficult because it's not just 2 people, it's 5, it's 10, it's 20, it's 500 people spread geographically,
Yeah.
different time zones, and incentivized in different ways with different skill sets and really different ways of looking at the world. So, yeah, I just wanted to comment on that before we sort of segue, unless you want to chuck any more volleys back.
I mean, there are a couple of things that jump to mind there, but really, I think it's the one thing I will say, and then we can move on to the true kind of like stuff we prepped for. Actually,
Yeah.
was the fact that we had a leadership coach at HubSpot who I thought was really insightful, and her name's Andrea Winter, and she was fantastic. She when she first met me, she heard me talk a couple times, and she was like, Matt, I think your role and your job, and frankly, what it sounds like you're passionate about is creating the conditions for others to succeed. And that to me was like so transformative in terms of how I looked at our job,
Yes.
because that can cover so many bases. Communicate, like a communication matrix of what messaging do you send in which capacity, like something as basic as that, or as seemingly over engineered or over formal as that, can just eliminate so much of the like miscommunication that tends to occur, or missed details that tend to occur when you go from 1 or 2 people to 5 to 10, 500, whatever you said before. And I think like creating those conditions, making sure everyone's clear on those conditions, and like that change management side of rolling that out, I think is just it is the job, really. I mean,
Yeah.
we could cut there, but I know there's a lot more we want to talk about. But that's it. Like that's what's so important, and it really defined how we tried to work together as a team, and it set up like our core competencies. It set up like our promotion like criteria for folks on the team. It was all tied to that and how efficiently and effectively you're able to do that type of work.
Conditions for success. That is a good segue into what we gathered today to talk about. So, as people are getting refills on their lattes at the Creative Operations Coffee Shop to continue to listen in on this conversation, I think it's one thing I think about is so. Tell us a little bit about where you are today and what you're doing, because it's not creative operations, but you've taken your operations skill set and applied them to this new role that you're in.
Yeah, correct. So I sort of had to like uh, finagle even my title to include operations, because my title right now, I'm the head of growth and operations at ScleraWorks. And ScleraWorks, we kind of tout ourselves as a digital transformation agency. Really, what we are is we provide support, staffing, and other like configuration solutions for teams who use software of any type, really. So our bread and butter tends to be the Atlassian suite. So if you're using Jira, if you're using Confluence, Bitbucket, anything in that realm, we are able to, handle licenses. We're able to configure, train, onboard administrate and maintain those solutions as well. And I heard about ScalaWorks the first time because I needed help with our Jira implementation at HubSpot. And I threw a dart on LinkedIn, found a guy who founded the company, is now my boss, and I moved over to work with them. And my role now, yeah, like when I got kind of onto the other side from a client to now an employee on the inside at ScalaWorks, one of the first things I realized was like, hey, our messaging isn't really all that clear, and our internal operations are a bit, shoestring, for lack of a better term. And that was one of my top priorities, was to kind of like deploy a lot of those skills that I had developed over, at the time, what would it have been, 12 or so, you know 13 years of creative operations and project management and digital production and just overall organization streamlining and condition creating. How could I do that for our organization to make us kind of punch above our weight a little bit and operate in a way where we were able to be more responsive to new leads, to client requests, to whatever the landscape or the market might be presenting. And then, I focused on that for a few months, and that also included streamlining a lot of our messaging on the website, and in some of our other collateral. But then we were like, okay, well, it's time to grow a little bit. And so I moved into, like you said, sort of that go to market, growth, sales, prospecting type of role, which is a massive departure, at least so I thought, from creative operations. And now my time is probably 80/20, the sales and growth and prospecting work, and is the 80, and then 20% is still sort of that operational oversight, where now we have some other folks on the team who tend to help with that. And it's a small organization too, like you alluded to. I think we have at the moment about 35, 40 people on the team. And a lot of those are IT specialists who are serving on contracts right now, as a support staff or staff augmentation solution for an organization that needs help with their QA or with their other ITSM or DevOps solutions. So that's where we're at now. That's where I'm at now, and that's what's been interesting to look back at some of the creative ops work and the challenges we solved, through this kind of like revised lens, if you will.
So, like, you're in a organization of a dramatically different scale.
Very
Like
much so, yeah.
it's it probably feels just as intense, right? Because HubSpot was much bigger, but it had 10, 100x the number of employees that you've got.
Yeah.
So you're a lot smaller, but there's still lots of things to do. Do you still bring that same operational mindset to like go to market in the way you operate and the way you're getting the company to operate as well?
100%. Yes, I think so. um, and I think a big sort of like purpose for that is, yes, SquareWorks is much, 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 much smaller than HubSpot. But when I started at HubSpot, I want to say the creative team was only about 35, 40
Okay.
people. And I mentioned I was sort of like, choking on 400 creative requests a year or whatever it was and trying to make sense of them as the only project manager on the receiving end of that intake form. And so I don't think I was able to really spend as much time focusing on some of the operational cues and operational like baselines that I probably could have or should have set up then. And having learned from that, I see ScalaWorks where we are right now. We talked about this, I can't remember if it was offline or at the beginning of the call, but um, a lot of those skills within creative ops, you take away the creative, that operation skill is pretty transferable. And so there's a
Sure.
lot of stuff that I really have tried to, impart into our enablement lead, sales enablement lead, to be like, hey, let's make sure we take that extra couple seconds to, or a couple minutes at the end of a call to make sure that we record our thoughts, we store the, auto generated like call summary somewhere so that we have really good record of this and we're using the systems the way they were intended to be used. And that would be, our CRM, our, we use Jira for our task management still, and all the little reminders and follow-ups that we set in those softwares, and then the storage of all of our assets in Google Drive. So it seems very much like blocking and tackling, when it comes to creative operations. But for me, that has been the thing that is most important, is like, I don't want to have a client ask me about a specific about their SOW and have no idea where that thing lives, because I'm not going to remember. I can't remember who half of my clients are sometimes. I hope they're not listening, because we're prospects in that matter, for that matter, because we're always trying to stay on top of the next big thing. But at the same time, it's like I need to stay vigilant of these folks. And so if the systems aren't up to date, if I'm not diligent about inputting these, if we don't have the right automations or tools in place to keep these updated and flowing and reminding us, then we're going to get completely turned around and start to lose business. And that to me is sort of like the number one difference, I would say, is proximity to the bottom line within my current role, as opposed to what I was doing in creative operations. And it might be a byproduct of being at a much smaller organization. But I feel like creative teams, because they tend to be a team within a team, usually nestled within marketing, um, you're a little bit more like insulated at times from the true like life or death impact of some of those types of bottom line conversations. And yes, it trickles through the entire organization. And yes, there's different pressures and visibilities there. But for me, when it's become sort of one of my number one responsibilities, it makes it that much more apparent and that much more important to adhere to a lot of these operational systems that we've configured and set up.
That so I want to double down on this because those that listen to the podcast regularly, you've heard me and you've heard others on here talk about like tying KPIs more to the marketing funnel, closer to, as you're calling it, like the bottom line of the business.
Yeah.
And I think that insulation you referred to for creative teams, creative ops teams, it's a double-edged sword. So on one hand, it can be beneficial in that, oh, on a day-to-day basis, when things seem to be going fine for the business, we can talk about like, oh, look at how much content we produced or how quickly we did it or cost efficiently, and all that matters.
Yeah. It's a
But
different
I
bottom
think
line almost there. Yeah. Yeah. You're right.
yeah, it's a different bottom line, and I think that's the bottom line of the creative operations leader,
Yeah.
and it's
It's a good
the
point.
operations part of the job. But when times get tough or people are looking to say, how do we streamline things? I think that insulation actually becomes it's the Achilles heel, because then it's hard to have a conversation with the CMO about like what is the business impact of what we do. And I have at least two conversations every week with people from in-house teams going like, I'm not really sure how to have that conversation with my
How do we
CMO,
measure? Yeah. Yeah. It's a
especially in these
major
days
issue.
of, everyone's, looking at how do we streamline costs? And well, can't we just throw AI at this stuff now? So I think it's more and more important for creative ops leaders to go, how do we tie ourselves more to the funnel, more to the dollars and cents of the business? And
Yeah.
I don't it's not always a straight line, but the answer can't be, I don't know, it's too hard to figure out. Like, no, we could figure that out. So it sounds like, having sort of now transitioned to the go to market side, if you were to go to a creative ops role tomorrow, is this sort of going to be like, one of the top three things that you're trying to figure out? Like, how do we make an impact on the funnel?
Yeah. I think so. And I think it would be one of the first things I do. And I think it's one of I might have mentioned him before, but I always like to shout this guy out. I know you've had him on the show, but Mark Brady, one of the most brilliant, smartest people I've ever worked with or been around for that matter. He was really instrumental when he came onto our team at HubSpot in terms of finding ways to generate that data, use that data to drive creative decisions. Because early days at HubSpot, people were like, my manager would be like, all right, we need some data from the team. That's not quite as compelling as a brief as make us the number one Halloween costume, but it's equally as vague to the point where it's like, okay, some data. Well, we closed X number of tickets in the last 12 months. And in my head, I'm like, fuck out, like who cares about that? Like that doesn't tell a compelling story,
Yep.
And I think, listening to the episode you did with Mark about how creative solutions, like, oh, here's the assets people are requesting within marketing. So this means there's a demand for this. That I would take that a step further in terms of sort of my next role in creative operations if it were to come to pass at some point. I think what was lacking for us, and yes, this isn't to discredit the marketers who provided us with the creative briefs and the insights and the stories, because they were all really good. Like there were a lot of great, really smart people that we worked with there on all fronts, all the stops in my career. But I do think for creatives, creative operations people, it is really helpful to listen into like customer pain. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like to be on a sales call, to read a couple emails from a client who is having a real problem, and then evaluating how do we solve that problem? How do we alleviate their concern? What sort of assets can we create for them? Whether it's a one pager that a sales rep can quickly fire off to alleviate those concerns, whether it is a immersive page on the website that very concisely encapsulates what exactly it is that we do to solve that need or solve that problem. Like I would say we did that for sure at HubSpot and at all the other places that I've worked, Arnold, Digitas, whatever. But I think being there on the ground floor really validates, oh shit, this is why this is important. This is, if this customer doesn't get this, they might leave and they're spending X thousands of dollars with us every year. You know what I mean? Like those sorts of, again, I don't want to make it be like scare tactics. I said life or death before, which is a dumb, connection to make because, this isn't brain surgery, no matter what we're talking about or disease. But at the same time, it's like when it comes to the life and death of a company or an organization, solving those problems can be paramount. And as someone now who is tasked with solving a lot of those real time, sometimes on the fly, sometimes with maybe an hour lead time or 24 hours lead time to get something out, there are so many times already because we're a smaller company where I've been frustrated like, shit, we don't have that. We don't have this enablement document. We don't have this product outline that I think is, or the service outline that is super clear and concise and covers those key valuation points or those differentiation points for us. And I think when it comes to creating those, whoever on our side winds up creating them, the insights they need are the ones that I think are provided by those customer conversations, by those sales conversations. And I think that insulation, like you talked about, it does cut both ways. But I think this is a piece where it would have been nice to be closer to those conversations and to those ideas and things like that, despite or on top of the best efforts that our marketing team and sales enablement team was doing to kind of like help feed them to us.
I think that's a really good point, and I know you're at the smaller organization now. I've sort of grown up in small companies, startups. Built a few over time in different industries, and I've always seen the value of being as close as possible to every part of the business and not necessarily like trying to put my hands in it and interfere, but
Right.
listening.
Yeah.
And I think we've all heard the stories of like some companies, the executive team has to spend 1 day a quarter or 2 days a year answering customer support calls, right? To get
Yeah.
an appreciation of what are customers actually saying? What are they frustrated by? What are they delighted by? And I think this idea, and it almost goes back to that idea of centralized, decentralized, right? If you are like, if you're an in-house team, like today, you're small. So if somebody goes, we need to like revamp the website or we need new sales collateral, you're going to go and spend some time with customers, with salespeople, maybe shadow them. If I'm an in-house agency leader or creative ops leader, I'm probably thinking about, well, maybe I do what some of those executive teams done. Like once a quarter, I'm gonna have, you know, a, every creative shadow a sales rep, and like for a day, and you might be amazed by what you find. Like, what are the emails they're sending? How are they trying to like find materials to send out? How do they want to maybe edit what's the template allows them to do or not do? What are they delighted by? What are they frustrated by? Because they're going to have their creative hat on and they're going to be looking at things differently because it's that different perspective. And they may find things that go, oh, well, we could probably make these things better. And they might find net new things that would actually help in the sales process, in the marketing process.
Yeah.
And then bring that back to the creative team, have a discussion about it, and then be able to go back to marketing leadership or sales leadership and go, we could do this for you. And here's how we think it's going to help your marketing funnel or your sales funnel. And that is also part of getting more deeply embedded with both of those funnels and closer to the outcomes of the business.
And it's not too different to what we talked about earlier around building relationships, establishing
Yeah.
trust, leading to new changes and new risks you feel comfortable taking. Like, it's funny you mentioned that because we had a program at HubSpot called HubSpot Mixers, and I was excited to sign up for it. When I told people I did, they like made fun of me. They're like, "You really do this?" But your name gets entered into like a lottery, and I think it's every month or every 2 months or something. You get paired with a random person throughout the organization. So I met A, so many cool people, but B, so many interesting people in positions so different from mine, who, similar to what I'm talking about in terms of going from creative ops for 15 years to now, go to market and growth and sales. Like, I learned that there was more we had in common than that was different about us in terms of the problems we were facing every day. And some of these folks were able to collaborate and end up working together and find ways that we could, help one another with some of the challenges we're facing day to day, because it's a classic case of like, you don't know what you don't know. And that environment really helped us with that. But I think everything you're talking about too, I think a lot of it also depends when it comes to the content you're creating and how much needs to be, spun up, and how you do it. A lot of it depends on the stage of the company too. Because when I first got to SquareWorks, like one of the guys we worked with, one of the main things he said, he was like our blog was looking a little JV. It had maybe 2, 3 posts, and they were all a little old. So if someone comes to the site, we don't look that legitimate. He was like, look, no one's going to read these from front to finish except for Google. So just churn out volume. And that's what we did. And there's some really helpful tools and assets and content that lives on the site now. But now we're at a stage where I think like value and differentiators need to be much more present there as opposed to just a volume play. And I think that is where those insights that you gain from talking to other folks who are right on the front lines, right at the bottom line, right in the customer space, that stuff becomes really important so that you can say, hey, this isn't just a generic topic that I know we need to talk about, or I know we need to push, or product marketing says is important. This is something that I heard word for word from someone, or I have heard repeatedly through these conversations that I've been listening in on, that we need to create some really high value, really like differentiated content around. And how can we do that? By using our creative, powers to kind of like move the needle a little bit more than just if we were to, build something out of a template. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's I really like this idea of like, how do we create more on purpose connections between these different departments and roles? Whether it's like ongoing, centralized, decentralized, or like more persistent, like day in the life of job shadowing, and also doing it the other way, inviting marketing and sales to go like, hey, come into the day in life of a project manager, a resource manager, of a creative. Like, what are they doing? How are they doing what they do? Because I think the default assumption is, oh, they press a button in Photoshop, and it's like,
Yeah.
no, it's that might be
We press two buttons, brother. Come on.
yeah, that might
Yeah.
be the absolute last step. But
Yeah.
understanding the creative thinking process, and it's again, it's creative operations thrives when it is rooted in like enabling human relationships, and that's based on communication and understanding, which then creates the container for collaboration, which is driven by curiosity, which opens the door to creativity, and that creates the right creative culture for an organization, which ultimately I think is where the future of creative operations is headed, is to like to nurture that creative culture, not just for the creative team but broadly for the organization. But that's my point of view, and I think that's going to happen because I think AI is going to automate a lot of that sort of systems and administration work with these intelligent agents that are coming. I think a lot of the narrative these days is just hot air, but um, those intelligent agents are coming. So the administrative work of status updates and who's on first, second, third type of thing, I think AI is going to step into that, and that's going to create an opportunity to spend more time on the human part of the equation, which is always the messiest and more complex part of it, but where you either destroy value or you create exponential value. That's my perspective. Like, what are your thoughts on the future of creative operations as we sort of get into the home stretch here?
Yeah, I think what you said there actually aligns kind of with what I was mentioning earlier. If I were to step into another creative operations role, what are some of the things that I would prioritize? And I look back at my time, at HubSpot specifically, but at other places, and whether it was a bandwidth issue, a focus issue, or just not thinking about it as much, a lot of stuff you were talking about, like the who's on first, the status, whatever else, I don't even know that that requires like something as complex as AI. A lot of it is just a really refined and well communicated and easy to read like dashboard solution. That's the purpose of like Kanban boards essentially is like, I'm thinking now for our prospecting work, it's like, all right, here are our incoming leads. Here's the ones that have been worked so far. Here's the ones that are qualified. Here's the ones that are waiting quotes. All that stuff. Like if I need to give a monthly report to my team, I can zip my mouth shut the whole time, and you can just pull up the dashboard and say this does what we need it to do. And I think at times focusing on the human stuff that you were talking about can distract from the need to do some of that systems legwork first. And I think at times in my career, I've been distracted by the human stuff because it kind of rejuvenates you a little more, oftentimes. And really, no matter what role you're in creative, whether it's operations or something else, you're always excited about that big, like, presentation of concepts, or something. It's like, all right, we're showing concepts today. Let's see how they're received. Things like that can, I think, pull away from some of the system building. But in terms of the future of the discipline, I'll be honest. I've actually seen, because there's still a part of me that I'm very happy with what I'm doing right now, and I feel like we're building something really cool at Squareworks. But I still have my LinkedIn alerts on for creative operations roles, and maybe it's because, like I said earlier, they took on so many different titles and names and structures back in the day. But I feel like I'm seeing a lot more than I would have even 1 or 2 years ago. And to me, that's encouraging that people are realizing there is importance to being the type of person who sets those conditions, sets those structures, sets that infrastructure. I think that creates, like we said, cutting both ways, that creates a risk where once that infrastructure is set, all right, do we punt that person to the curb and just let the machines run the work that we're doing? Some people will undoubtedly think that way. And in some cases, that might actually work. But I do think down the line, like, it's going to be incredibly important to, we talked about this a lot at HubSpot, like promote the work you're doing and the outcomes that it is providing. Because if we are insulated from that bottom line, as I'm seeing now, and kind of like removed from it 1 or 2 degrees, it's really important to understand the impact that the work does have. And as long as that impact remains, then I envision creative operations, it's probably like a contrarian take, but I think it's going to like, remain important and probably just like stay pretty similar to the way it is now, because I really do think that you talked on a recent podcast about brand being like your moat and one of the more important moats here over time. It's like the point I made about the quality over the quantity. Like the work needs to be really good, and I think AI is so valuable for creating prompts for generating against prompts for creating like you know stuff that can happen at 10x, 1,000x times what the human brain can do. But I really do feel like you know, if the inputs aren't really strong, then we're going to wind up in a place where a lot of the work suffers for that. And I think like creative operations folks who can really drive that integration to the other teams to learn from and truly decode what the needs are of the business, I think that's going to continue to grow as a big need within the discipline.
Yeah, so why don't we end there? Because it's in the age of AI, um, inputs is everything. Where do we want to go? Why? And what does good look like? And going back to the your comment about systems, I think about AI as I think today when we think about creative operations and the system that they're designing, a lot of it is rooted in still process, right? Like how do we enable scale, speed, cost efficiency? Again, all that's important. But that to me is a lot of programmatic work. It's algorithmic work, or better said, algorithmic work. And
Mm.
I think that's what AI is really good at is the algorithmic work. Like we have this much to do, we have this much time or resources available. We know what our priorities are. Help me figure out the math of like what should our top three priorities be, and then the human gets to make the final call. I think the system in a world where we can produce 10,000 or 100,000 at the click of a button. And to your comment about inputs, I think the system we need to think more about is the through line from today's episode is it's us, it's the humans. How do you create the system of how the humans work well together? How do they understand each other, communicate with each other, collaborate? How do we create environments to like not just talk about curiosity and creativity, but create the conditions where curiosity and creativity, that innate curiosity and creativity in all humans comes forward, and that creativity in any organization is not a, a box on the org chart. It is part of how we think and operate as a company. Because I think like brand's going to be a moat. Brand being a moat is going to be a function of, are we actually activating and harnessing our collective curiosity and creativity across the whole organization? And I
Yeah.
think that's the future and opportunity for creative operations leaders is to think bigger.
And I think harnessing that creativity and harnessing those opportunities, that's where I think we talk about creative briefs. Some of the most important pieces of a brief are the insights. And I think that's one of the benefits that I've seen the most from AI is just parsing repetitive insights across wide volumes of conversations, meetings, pitches, whatever else. And if you can start to generate some data from that to help create problem statements, to help create insights that then help drive creative work, I think that can be a really valuable utilization that I think we're just kind of scratching the surface on when it comes to like one-on-one meeting summaries or client call summaries and things like that. Like I mentioned, getting closer to the sales team, closer to the sales enablement team, the CS team, whatever, probably automate a lot of that, day in the life type of stuff through some sort of AI solution. But I also do feel like, going 100% that direction could have its downsides too. But, for creative, we've seen a lot of value too in prototyping, obviously, with AI tools, where if you have a rough idea, it's a lot easier to make it a lot less rough than maybe it was even 1 or 2 years ago. And so when it comes to that data and those prototypes and those like idea starters, I feel like that's where it's really, really valuable and where creative operations teams like have been and need to continue harnessing the power of that technology. But yeah, I forget, what did you say? It was like, prompting people or engineering people or whatever. However you describe the idea of keeping people at the center of this while still, solving these problems in more innovative ways. Like that's kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, it's prompting humans.
Prompting humans, that's it. Yeah.
That, that's the second podcast. Actually, if people go to tomorrowwithnish.com, you'll see that I've released a whole bunch of mini episodes. It'll end up taking you to YouTube, where I think you'll find 15 or 20 of them. But yeah, maybe my self promotion is a good place to end. And what I'm going to be thinking about, where you've really piqued my curiosity, Matt, that I'm grateful for, is like the system, the work for creative ops leaders is the people. I think the other parts are important, but it's the people that is the X factor and the difference maker between good enough and high impact on the organization.
Yeah, got to stand out, man. It's fun to do fun and good work, and that's kind of what drives it all. So appreciate you
Yeah.
having me. This was great.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right. Thanks, Nish. See ya.